You are listening to Inside the Notes. I'm your host, Erica Block. Here we have the opportunity to listen to the stories that connect our musical family tree. First-hand accounts of performances, musicians, and mentors that shape the way we listen, learn, and teach. On today's episode, we're chatting with Christina Smith, principal flute of the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra and the Bellingham Festival of Music. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
This has been such a strange year for musicians, and the ASO seems to have done a lot of really cool pre-recorded concerts and different events for your patrons. Is there anything that you've done this season that you hadn't done, or a different version of something, a smaller version that was actually kind of interesting to do for you?
I am so grateful and so proud of my institution for what we have been able to accomplish this season, given that some orchestras haven't accomplished anything or really, been able to produce music for their public, and also musicians have been cut off. ASO has been producing a new concert every week. So it's, like we normally do, except it's not like we normally do. We are very distanced on stage, plexiglass around winds and brass, and a total of 35 musicians maximum at any time. And I would say we have done a lot of standard repertoire this year that we are approaching in kind of a different way. We don't play much music that is for chamber orchestra or chamber size orchestra. For example, so when we program on a subscription concert normally, and we're doing a Beethoven symphony or a Mozart symphony or a Haydn symphony, we have a very full strings for those concerts. But given our COVID protocol and the reduced number of musicians on stage, we're really doing them in the way that they were intended. They're truly the chamber size. And that has been really, really nice. I have to say, I've thought that I belong playing in a chamber orchestra. I really love that size. I love the intimacy of that size of an orchestra. Now, don't get me wrong. I love my Mahler. I love my Strauss. I love the big orchestral works, which of course we are not able to do at this time.
Right.
But we've really done a lot of standard repertoire in a smaller setting, a little bit more exposed, if you will. And this experience of playing quote unquote concerts for an empty hall has been very bizarre, to say the least.
Yes.
Many of us, myself included, have just realized how much we rely on the energy coming back to us from the audience members. So that's something that I can't wait to come back and have our wonderful patrons in the hall and feel that energy, that energy of a live performance.
Yes.
And because when you're recording, it's also different in that it's not this just moment in time and then it's gone. And that's something that's just so wonderful about live performance. But we're doing these recordings, and in many ways, many of my colleagues, we all feel like it's so much more stressful because it's all being captured and it's there. And when you're looking at putting something as a live stream on the internet, it's there permanently. So we have this different type of kind of performance energy that exists that I never felt it before.
Absolutely. That's so cool, because that was going to be a question I had for you way later, since you have done so many recordings. But I was really curious kind of how you go about kind of wrapping your head around a piece when you know it's for all time versus for the energy of the moment. Do you find that you kind of interact with risk-taking and negotiating how you're going to perform your part differently when you know that it's recorded versus playing live and you're, interacting with the energy? Or do you try and just play the way you're going to play?
I do feel like it dampens that spontaneity,
Yeah.
that possible risk-taking that I might engage in a live concert, because it's like I was saying, it's, when you play that live concert, many of our concerts are recorded anyway, and they're later kind of edited between 2 or 3 performances and put on the
Mhm.
radio. That's not the same feeling as what we're experiencing right
Right.
now, and I think I don't feel as free
Yeah.
on stage during these recordings, because one of the restrictions that we do have because of complex media agreements, et cetera, is that we are only allowed to record a part of a piece, a movement, twice, and then they can take some editing between the 2 takes, but they're often just working with
Whoa.
the best of the 2. And that, of course, when you play in an orchestra and you're making a recording for a CD or a digital release, we can go back and fix one note. We can
Right.
go back and cut and paste to the nth degree, but this is not allowed in the current agreement that we have during COVID. And I think that's how most orchestras are operating. So it's
Yeah.
very, very different.
Absolutely, and not to mention, you don't even have that kind of comfort synergy of feeling like your co-section is near you and together, and you're working with intonation together, you're all spread out. So, what kinds of things have you done to kind of change how you're hearing across the sections and into the next area when everyone's wrapped in plastic?
Oh, you nailed that. That's exactly what we're experiencing. It's so difficult to hear my section. It's so difficult for my second flutist to hear me.
Mhm.
We're guessing a lot. Um, I find myself, I think, moving a little bit more with the phrases so that there's a little bit more stability and indication where things are going or where I'm going to
Yeah,
play something, versus how I normally move during, when we're sitting in our normal configuration
yeah,
where we're closer together. And it's very nerve wracking, I would
yeah,
say, because we are so far apart and we can't hear each other. We're hopeful that going forward, many of the musicians in the orchestra are fully vaccinated. We're hoping that at least for winds and brass, we can just remove that plexiglass, because that
yeah.
would be such an improvement.
Wow, it's just a stunning adventure when you can see how far we've actually come back from what's normal, and you can find a way to sustain and keep playing concerts even in these insane situations. It will make coming back feel so good.
It definitely will.
That's really cool. I'd love to talk a little bit kind of about the beginning, when you kind of not only fell in love with flute, but what was the experience that you had that made you go, "This is definitely it for me. This is gonna be what I'm gonna spend my life working on."
That's a great question, because I come from a family of non-musicians. My parents are not musical at all. And I saw a flute on Sesame Street when I was 4, and I begged and begged, and I said, "I wanna play the flute. I wanna play that." And I started flute lessons when I was 7, and between age 4 and 7, what had to happen was my arms had to grow long enough so I could reach the keys on the instrument, because as we know today with flutes, for beginner flutists, they make them now with these curved head joints or
Right.
mouthpieces, so that the students can start much younger. They could probably start when they were 4,
Wow, yeah.
but in the '70s, that was not the case, and I did have to grow so I could reach the keys on the flute. But I really was in love with the sound and in love with the way you use air to make the sound, the vibration of the tube. I loved music. I listened to music incessantly when I was a child. I had the classical station on and a little radio in my room all the time. And I was lucky enough to start playing in youth ensembles, youth orchestras when I was very young, even in middle school.
Mhm. That's
And
awesome.
yes, and I'm very lucky even with strings,
Yeah.
so that kind of orchestral repertoire. But I think the turning point for me was when I was a freshman in high school. I started playing in the San Francisco Symphony Youth Orchestra, and
Wow.
I will never forget my first rehearsal. We started with the overture to Die Meistersinger, and that
Oh,
first C major chord on the stage at Davies Symphony Hall, I thought I was just gonna come unglued. I mean, I've just never heard anything like that, and
yeah.
I was just hooked. I knew
Yeah.
I wanted to play in an orchestra,
That's so
and,
cool.
when you play flute, as you know, you're really in the middle, back to
Mhm.
front and side to side, and it's
Yeah.
this stereo sound. I mean, I'll just never forget it, and every time I play that overture since, I have that same remembrance of that moment.
That's that's so cool, and it's so music is so interesting in that way because there's this kind of young child version of music, or if you go through the band system, there's like, this is how we're introduced to it, but then when you have one of those moments, it's like, "Oh, wait, this is a completely different thing. This is intense and addicting and overwhelming," and I feel like everyone has some version of their experience where it just hits you like lightning, and you're like, "This is it. This is it."
Yeah, I love the word addicting. That would describe me, that's for
Yeah.
sure.
It's like, "More, please."
Yeah.
Did you have special recordings that you loved listening to once you kind of really got into it through high school? Did you have heroes and flutists that you looked to for sound and color and things like that?
I did. I was remembering the other day how when I was in high school, my youth orchestra in San Francisco played Mahler Symphony Number 4, and I had a wonderful recording of that with Krista Ludwig singing in the 4th movement, and I literally wore out that cassette, like, it wouldn't play anymore after
Yeah.
a certain point, and I remember that was the first Mahler symphony that I ever heard, not only played, but ever even heard.
Cool.
And I just couldn't believe that somebody could write music like that. And I think for many of us who play in orchestras, Mahler symphonies are absolute highlights throughout our
Yes.
careers. They're just
Absolutely.
for a musician's musician. They're just for really the joy of playing in an orchestra. They're so intricate. Each part is so important and
Mhm.
detailed, and so I was remembering that. But when I was a student, it was back in the days where if you wanted to listen to a piece, there were no iPhones, there weren't 50 recordings in the palm of your hand at all
Yep.
times. so
Exactly.
so I just remember saving up money so many times to go to Tower Records, to the classical
Mhm.
department, and
Flip
pick
through.
pick which recording of Daphnis and Chloe that I wanted to listen to. But I would say that my flute heroes as a student were definitely Jean-Pierre Rampal, who is one of the most recorded classical artists of all time. He made over
Yeah.
360 recordings, and his recordings that are like pre-1975 are to me just stunningly beautiful, and just how a flute is supposed to sound.
Yes.
Yes, I am old school,
I love it. I
and
love it.
and then the other hero I had was actually who I ended up studying with in college, which is Julius
Julius
Baker.
Baker. So
And
cool.
his recordings with the New York Philharmonic are some of my favorites. I love his sound, and I love his orchestral playing. I love his solo playing. He was an absolute inspiration to me.
That's amazing. So when you got to go study with him, had you already realized the heaviness and the amazingness of that experience? Were you prepared going in, or once you got there, did you really understand the potential and the enormous amazingness that it was gonna be studying with him?
I think I realized it more when I first started studying. I
Mhm.
didn't really get it until I joined that flute studio and experienced lessons with him, and actually I'll say experienced his playing in the same room as me. And
Yeah.
when I studied with Mr. Baker, he I mean, I know he had his 75th birthday when I was studying with him, so he was already, an older player and
Mhm.
past his retirement age, but he could wipe the floor with me. I mean, he could play. anything. And I always had he was an early riser. So I always had, my lessons were often at 8 o'clock in the morning. So
Oh my god.
when you're a college
You're
student,
like,
that's pretty brutal. Yeah. I needed toothpicks to hold my eyes open. But and he was such an interesting teacher too. He was very interested in his students being able to double tongue anything at any speed beautifully, so
huh.
the the way he started every lesson was we always had to have a pianist in every lesson because he liked to teach the
Wow.
solo repertoire. But we started our lesson playing the second movement of the Bach C major sonata. Of course, it's all double tonguing from
Mhm.
memory with piano accompaniment. And then we were to play the Voliere from the Carnival of the Animals from memory at eighth note equals 176 with our piano accompanist. And then we started our lesson.
Wow.
So it was just, that's how every lesson began. And
Wow.
that's how he wanted us to warm up. And I'll say it really improved my tonguing.
That
I
it
have to
did.
say. Yeah.
What about at the
Yeah.
beginning? Like, you walk in freshman year and he's like, "This is what we do. This is how we roll." Were you just totally overwhelmed, or were you like, "Oh, this is cool. Sure."
Well, I think, when I was that age, I had this excitement at the challenge of
Yeah.
like, well, I know I can do this. I'm gonna try. And, I was
Yeah.
kind of an
That's
overachiever. So, but now I look back at it and I think, oh, I can't imagine. How did I do that?
yeah,
You
at 8 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
Did he, was he a storyteller at all? Did he impart any, moments of his life or any golden nuggets for you about performing and playing that you remember? Or was he more, drill and kill and do this and get out of here?
The era that I studied with Mr. Baker, he was more of a storyteller, and he used to tell stories of being on tour with the New York Philharmonic and all the artists he used to play with. Mr. Baker actually played with a lot of really famous jazz artists.
Cool.
He actually lived in the same building, I think, as Stan Getz at one point. He had
Wow.
a really interesting career. Like he could play anything really, and he loved to tell stories. I just remember he also really wanted us to play a new piece every week. So one of the things I
Wow.
learned from him was how to learn music quickly. And
Yes.
there are many pieces that I barely remember because I didn't spend very much time on them, but of course I've come back to them later. But he was very much a teacher who wanted us to build our repertoire quickly. And that was a blessing in many ways because as an orchestral player, we play a new program every week. Now, granted, a
Mhm.
lot of it is repeats of big classical war horses that we
Right.
play. But with the solo repertoire, I'm really grateful that he demanded that.
That's stunning. Did he ever interact in orchestral excerpts with you, or was he really more soloistic and in these specific technique things?
He really preferred to teach the solo repertoire in spite of him being principal flute of the New York
Right.
Philharmonic for, I think, 25 years. And he had this tremendous expertise with orchestral playing, but he
Right.
really wanted to hear the solo repertoire. And when I was a student at Curtis, Jeffrey Kaner, the current principal
Mhm.
flutist of the Philadelphia Orchestra, had just begun teaching at the Curtis Institute. I think I might have come to Curtis his first year in the Philadelphia Orchestra or close to it. And so we had this incredible benefit of Jeff Kaner working on a lot on excerpts with us.
Cool.
So, and he really taught me my excerpts, and he taught me how to practice. He was a very
Cool.
demanding teacher and an amazing inspiration.
That's incredible. That was kind of the best of both worlds then. Did he do
It
every
was.
class with you? Did you have, like, a set amount of time that you could go, or you just had to go and find him and get working?
Um, in the early days, we went and found him and got working, especially if we were preparing for an audition. Definitely the expectation was we would find him and really hone our experts. But at the Curtis Institute, there's a class every week. If it's still on Monday afternoons, I don't know, but it's
Probably.
the wind class, where we read through major pieces of orchestral repertoire with the winds and brass, and got to learn a lot of repertoire that way as well. At the
That's
time, that was taught by Richard Woodhams when I was a student, and
that's really cool.
um, that was also a very demanding class.
Wow, that's incredible, and you get to learn so much about interacting with the wind section that way. That's
Definitely,
invaluable.
definitely.
Wow. So was the ASO your first audition? I know you weren't even done school when you got in, so how did that all unfold for you?
I was not done with school. I had taken I had taken 2 other auditions. One of them was the when it was back when the Boston Symphony was, first fluteless for
Yes.
many, many years, and they had one of their national auditions, and, uh, I had taken that, and then, um, after my 2nd year of Curtis, Jeff Kaner had called me and said, "They're having another audition for principal flute in Atlanta, and I think you should go just for the experience and to start building your audition experience." And I said, "Okay." And so I it was in the summer. I was studying at Tanglewood at the time, and so I got the time off from Tanglewood and flew down to Atlanta. And I'm from California. I didn't know anything about the South. I'm thinking, Atlanta, they have an orchestra there. I thought that was like Gone with the Wind country. Like I had no idea anything. I had not traveled to this part of the country ever, and and I also, this is interesting. When I took this audition, because Jeff Kaner had planted in my head that I'm doing it for the experience. It's probably my
Right.
first of 25 auditions before I might ever be
Right.
be successful. Um, I really thought there was no way I was going to get hired. Like there was no way I was going to get the job. And so I feel like when I took my audition, I played with I took a lot of chances, and I played with a lot of freedom because I thought, "Oh, I'm just getting my feet wet here." But
Mhm.
prelims and then finals, and then they asked me to do a trial week, and I thought, "Oh, this is getting serious." So then I played a trial week. We had an outdoor concert. We played Beethoven 7, and then I went back to Tanglewood, and 3 days later they called and offered me the job.
Wow, that's awesome. It's the headspace though, so often people say when they finally, like, pulled their personality or winning and losing it with their value of self away, then that's when the success happened, or when they were able to think to themselves, "It's okay, maybe the next one," then that's when it happens. So, it sounds like your headspace was perfect because you were in an exploratory and not, defense and not fear, but, like, "Let's see what happens."
Absolutely, and I have a lot of colleagues who came from that same headspace when they met with success. It's
Mhm.
when they were able to remove that, "Oh, if I don't get this job, I don't know what I'm gonna do," with this external pressure that we put on ourselves. And I know of other colleagues that that's when they started to be successful.
Absolutely. So, what was your first year like there? Did you kind of continue in that headspace, or did it ever kind of hit you and feel like, oh, this is a lot riding on my back, and principal is a big deal? Or were you like, oh, this is awesome. It's just like school, and I'm just going to keep going?
I think partway through my first year, I realized how grueling it
Hmm.
is to do this job. You have to be on all the time, how
Yeah.
everybody can hear every note you play. You're leading a section, and for me, at the very beginning, of course, there were many, many pieces that I played for the first time on the job in the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra.
Right.
And yeah, that's kind of a staggering thought, but I was very lucky to have the colleagues that I had that were so supportive and just wonderful to me. But I spent a lot of time studying,
Hmm.
of course, in a different way than I do now. This is my 30th season in the orchestra, so a lot of time has gone by. But yeah, those early days were a bit scary. But my 3rd week in the orchestra, we went on a 3-week massive European tour,
Oh
and
my
it was
gosh.
just, night after night after night. I'll never forget it, but, that was really trial by fire.
Absolutely. Wow, yeah, like you're saying, everything's a first at that point.
Yeah.
Do you have a couple memories through all of those different tours and all of these different concerts where you specific nights stick out to you as like, "Man, that night was electric," and you could really feel all the goodness from it? Little memories like that that stick out to you?
I do. I would say, a lot of the moments that really stick out to me were my first 9 years in the orchestra. Robert Shaw was still our conductor emeritus, and
Cool.
he even made a CD almost every year with the orchestra, because back then the orchestra was recording all the time. It's one Atlanta Symphony is one of the most recorded orchestras in the United States, and those moments with Mr. Shaw just really stood out to me. I just feel so lucky that I got to work with him. He was a
Yes.
consummate musician, and doing things like the St. Matthew Passion with Mr. Shaw were absolutely unforgettable.
That's incredible. What do you think it was about his conducting style that made it so compelling to both the orchestra and the chorus? I feel like sometimes people who specialize in chorus, they feel the love, but it feels different for the orchestra because it's a different kind of hand gesture. What made him so great with both groups?
That's a $1,000,000 question right there, and I'm not even sure I can answer it
Yeah.
because it's I think Mr. Shaw did not have a really refined orchestral conducting technique. He was
Mhm.
definitely a choral conductor,
Mhm.
but when he stood on the podium, he had this commitment to the music that you just couldn't not jump on that train. I
Mhm.
mean, it was like so much of it was his eyes, his facial expression, perhaps some of these intangible energies that we get when certain musicians are on stage with us that we can't even put our finger on. I
Yeah.
feel like he is absolutely in that category.
That is so
And
cool.
he could just, move his right shoulder and he'd get a different color out of the orchestra, and the
Right.
chorus. And it wasn't something that, was a traditional conducting technique. It was just he had just an exquisite way of communicating music.
That's awesome. I feel like a lot of people say the same kind of thing about Carlos Kleiber, where just the presence is evoking enough interest in everyone who's participating that the slightest movement can create a ripple effect through the orchestra. And that's stunning, those people who have that ability to do that.
It is, and I wish I could have worked with Carlos Kleiber. I have watched dozens of videos of him conduct, and they're just mesmerizing.
It really is. It's so inspiring. I love when you have the opportunity to work with somebody like that. Of course, it sticks in your mind, and every time you play that piece, it brings you back to that moment.
Mhm.
And I think I love that most about the opportunity to repeat pieces. And so now that you've been there for 30 years, every time you play something, you kind of remember the last time you played it and you get these memories that pile up. Yet there is a monotony to playing Beethoven 5 for the 700th time. What's your kind of thought process as you go through another round with a piece that you know so well? How do you keep it fresh? And what kinds of things go through your head when you interact with a piece like that?
We definitely have pieces that we repeat often, and we go in phases that we repeat them
Mhm.
more than we should. Beethoven's Fifth is one of them. It's funny that
Yes.
you chose that as an example. It's some of the Tchaikovsky symphonies, Tchaikovsky Fifth, certain
Yeah.
pieces that they just show up on my music stand
You're like,
a little too frequently. But, it's interesting. It there's the cliche of, every concert, there's gonna be one person out there that it might be their first time hearing the music or hearing that
mhm.
piece or hearing an orchestra play, and I know it's something that people say all the time, but I literally think about that. I think
That's
about that
awesome.
yeah, like when I'm playing Beethoven's Fifth, and if perhaps I'm thinking, "Oh, I wish we were doing something different," But it's an absolute masterpiece, and sometimes I find myself in those situations where it's something I've repeated many, many times. I just think about how I can make my own performance the best that it can be. How can I play this phrase better? How can I um, be more present in my music making? How can I phrase differently? And I try to change things and improve what I'm doing, and I can have more of a consciousness of that when it
Mhm.
is music that is so familiar. We do play a lot of new music in Atlanta, which has been wonderful. I mean, not every new piece is a good piece, as we know, but
Yep.
a lot of them are worthy and they're challenging, and you have to count like crazy, and you have to woodshed these technical passages. But um, I can't think about things like that when I'm just trying to not come in the wrong place,
Right,
So
right.
there's almost a gift with these war horses that we repeat over and over again, where I can break out of the the mold of concentrating on the technique of the music, but just thinking about the bigger picture of what I'm doing, and I actually really enjoy that.
I think that's awesome, and presence is always better than autopilot, so if you can find a way to keep insisting on yourself to improve or change or react differently, then it's easier to stay present, it seems,
It
than
is.
just being like, "Okay, then the repeat, here we go again."
Right.
It's the monotony that I think is the killer, and
Yeah.
especially having done it probably 300 times, that takes a lot of presence and thoughtfulness to make sure that you're staying in the game.
Yeah.
How do you when you've got different stuff every week like that and plenty of other things going on, do you always have a plan if you look at your month schedule and like, okay, these 5 things are gonna take a lot of time practicing. Do you have a kind of routine that you do, or is it just week by week?
To use the word routine is probably a little too formal. Um, I think when I was a younger member of the orchestra, I had much more of a set routine, but then
Mhm.
life happens. Now I have
Right.
two teenage girls, and our
Yeah.
our days really change. But in terms of routine, um, I have found as an older player now that because I'm not learning from scratch most of the music that we play, it's more important for me that my routine be staying in absolutely the best shape I can with my own playing. So it's about the basics, the long tones, scales, and arpeggios. I am a big fan of practicing etudes, and I practice a lot of etudes. And sometimes I just work on the etudes that all my students are doing that week, and
Yeah,
sometimes I do other ones. And so I find that like 90% of my preparation to do my job anymore is that kind of a practicing.
that's
Um,
awesome.
and then there are the pieces that come up that I'm like, "Oh, there's
Mhm.
there's the Russian Easter Overture. I better, get my game on, make sure I can really play this." Or like I said, with new music, obviously
Right,
that is learning the piece from scratch, and those would take more time on the piece itself.
right.
But mostly, I feel I'm at my best when I'm in shape with all the foundational parts that it takes to play the flute well.
Absolutely. Instead of, thinking in the back of your head, "Oh, like, now I have to worry about this too."
Yes,
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. Do you when you're burnt out and you're like, "I can't go on any farther, I can't do it, I'm so tired, I'm so this," is there a piece that you pull out to just play or something that you enjoy doing that kind of rejuvenates your energy?
Oh, that's such a great question. I would say that my go-to pieces are definitely Bach. I go back to Bach. We have 6 sonatas on the flute that are just fantastic. We have a partita, and even I sometimes play, Bach etudes that are arranged from other instruments for the flute. But I think Bach is my favorite composer, and I love to come back and just reset my brain with
Yeah.
that. Um, but I would say another way that I really reset when I'm burned out, and this might sound weird, is I absolutely love teaching, and I feed off the energy I get from all of my students. And I honestly feel that I've probably learned more from my students than they have from me.
Wow.
And I mean, I could spend an hour teaching someone, how to play a C major scale and just love it.
That's awesome.
And that
That's
that actually recharges my battery.
that's awesome, and because you hear yourself say things, and then you're like, "Oh, well, yeah."
Yeah.
Like, all the time, it just kind of comes around and goes around, or they question something that you have thought of, as obvious, but then you have to explain it. It's
That's
like,
right, that's right, and it has absolutely strengthened me as a player. It's made me a much better player
"That's
being a
really
teacher.
cool." Have you found your pedagogy has changed, over the years, or did you start off kind of going the way Mr. Baker taught you and morphed from that, or have you kind of ended up where you are?
Well, I think that when I first started as a teacher, I really started my first year in Atlanta, which was now 30 years ago, and I think I did teach a lot more in a formulaic fashion, like maybe the way that I was taught by Mr. Baker and some of my high
Mhm.
school teachers. But I think, and I hope, the thing that I've learned somewhat along the decades has been the most important part of teaching is to meet the student where they are. So there is no formula that works for every student. Everyone is coming to the flute from a different place, a different part of their life. I have a very diverse studio of very serious high school students. I have college students. I have college students who are not majoring in music. And I have a whole slew of adult amateurs who studied flute along their lives to varying degrees, who want to just become better players for the sake of loving flute more. And that's almost my favorite demographic
Yeah,
to
that's the
teach.
most inspiring.
Right, because they're not there because someone's forcing them, or they're there
Yeah.
because they just wanna learn and they wanna become a better player, and, um, I feel that meeting each person where they are, for whatever they're trying to get out of it. The goal is to have people feel good about it, and
Yeah.
that they have a love of playing the flute and a love of music. And what portal can you go in their brain and get
Yes.
them get them there? And every person is different, and that's a great challenge that I really love to take on.
Absolutely, such a puzzle to figure out, like, what's working, what's not, how do they tick,
Yeah,
how can you word it in such a way that's gonna be a good analogy that their brain's gonna grab onto.
right,
It's
right.
it's really cool.
Yeah, it is.
Can you tell us a little bit about your flute? I know it has a really cool story, and a cool history to it, and it's unique. We'd love to hear about it.
Yeah, I love talking about my flutes. So I have 3 flutes that I regularly play in the Atlanta Symphony, and they're all handmade by Vern Powell. And the Powell Flute Company, of course, still exists. It's one of the big flute makers in
Mhm.
Boston, and Vern Powell started the company. And when he first started making flutes, he handmade the flutes himself with some helpers in his studio. And the flutes that I play on are what we call vintage Powells. They were all
Mhm.
handmade by Vern Powell. So I have two flutes that were made in 1938, and one
Wow.
one is silver and one is solid platinum, which is a
Wow.
very special flute that, it's and the unusual thing about it is that there is no foot joint. So the flute come most flutes come apart in 3 pieces. This has just the head joint and a very long tube for the body.
Wow.
So it has a really
Wow.
a really long case that annoyingly doesn't fit in any flute bag or backpack or
Right.
anything. So, but, it's very special. It was made for Joseph Mariano, who was a very famous flutist and teacher at the Eastman School of Music and taught many players playing today and
Cool.
in orchestras. And I think it only has 2 pieces because I think Mr. Powell was not used to working with platinum, and he wanted to maybe keep
Ah,
keep the tube light enough, take away weight off of the tube to keep it vibrant. But it's a really lovely flute. And then most recently, the last I don't know, 7 or 8 years, I've been playing almost exclusively on an incredible vintage Powell flute that was made in 1950. and
Ooh.
it's made out of solid 14 karat white gold, and
Wow.
it is a flute that I have paperwork on and letters written by Mr. Powell where he refers to it as his masterpiece. And he and, it's a very, very special flute. I really love playing it. He only made 1 flute out of white gold his entire career, and the story is that that material is so hard to work with.
Mhm.
It's so dense, it actually broke all the tools in a shop. He said, I'm done with this. I'm not doing this anymore." Um, so it was very labor intensive to make the flute, and, um, it's absolutely spectacular for those of us who like to play the older instruments. It's
Yeah.
pretty special, and it's funny, the last time I went to a flute convention and I go in the exhibit halls where all the flute makers are, the flute makers come up to me and they say, "Do you have the flute?"
It
'Cause they all wanna see it, because it's unique and it's just,
Wow.
really a masterpiece.
Do you know who had that flute prior to you or who he
I
made that flute
do,
for?
I do. He made the flute for a man named Fritz Baker who played, I believe in the Colorado Symphony, the San Diego Symphony, and he was the only owner. There was one
Wow.
owner, and it was his family that was selling the flute several years ago after he passed away, and, um, a wonderful collector in Southern California bought the flute, and he has a heart of gold, and he really wanted the flute to be played. And he knew that I played old vintage Powells, and he said,
Mhm.
"Would you like to play on this flute?" And so I've been playing it since then, and we're working out that I am in the process of purchasing it. So
Wow,
because
that's
yeah,
incredible.
I really do love it.
It's incredible. What are the sound differences between solid platinum and solid 14 karat white gold?
There's quite a bit of difference. The platinum is heavier,
Mhm.
and the platinum to me has a little bit darker, steelier sound.
Mhm.
And the white gold is very shimmery and just a little bit more buoyant in sound, so they really can be used for different things. I do go back to my platinum flute when I'm playing the big orchestra war horses. I'll often play it for our Mahler and our Strauss
Mhm.
tone poems and things like that. But oddly, the platinum plays Bach really well. It has a very nice pianissimo to it, but the white gold just has a different voice. It's sparkly and
Mhm.
it's nimble, and so they really do have these different qualities to them.
Did you or have you, changed head joints into more modern head joints, or do you play the original things that came with the flute?
That's a great question. I play everything original. I don't
Cool. Wow.
play any modern head joints. I Everything I play was made for that instrument. It's the head joint that came with it. So,
That is so cool, and
yeah.
flute has had so much forward motion in the mechanism and all of the trimmings and the endless choices and selections. What about the vintage, mechanism would modern players find challenging?
That's a hard question for me to answer because I really have only played vintage flutes my whole career, but
Yeah.
I would say, I think the mechanism on the old flutes, as long as you keep it in really good shape and you have it worked on every 6 to 9 months and it's cleaned and then
Mhm.
it's oiled properly, I don't think there's any mechanism issues. I would say that a lot of people pick up these flutes and a lot of people who play modern flutes
Yeah,
pick
modern.
these flutes up and they say, "Oh, it's so hard to play."
And what do they mean by that? Is it, the way that it takes the wind or the intonation, or what are they thinking?
Both. It's the way that it takes the airstream, the way that the inside of the embouchure hole is cut, and that embouchure hole is, where we blow our air into.
Mhm.
They're cut very differently today than they were in the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, and they're cut in a way today that actually does make the flute a little easier to play, but there's always a cost benefit analysis with
Right,
everything.
right.
So, I liken these old vintage flutes to the difference between driving a manual transmission car versus an
Yes,
automatic transmission
totally.
car. And if
Totally.
you're the personality type like me that I like to have a little more control over what I'm doing, um, and you have to be in good shape all the time to get the most bang for your buck out of these things, um,
Then it's worth
then
it.
it's worth
Mhm,
it. Then
mhm.
the reward is there's just an incredible vibrancy and voice and warmth to these instruments that I haven't really ever found on another instrument.
That's so cool, and flute and bassoon are, I guess, the lucky woodwinds that can enjoy instruments that have a past and a history, whereas oboe and clarinet need to replenish too often.
I know, I was just saying this to an oboist last week. I said, "Not only do we not have to play to make reeds, we
Yes,
get to play the same instrument our entire career if we want to." Right?
exactly. It really is it's a different beast altogether.
It
But
is.
that's really cool, and I love, how personal instruments are for people, and I feel like that's something that people looking in the audience may not always appreciate how specific it is and why you pick it and how you pick it and the colors and the sounds that we're looking for and what you're willing to pay to get what you get, the response and all those kinds of things. It varies so much from person to person.
It really does. I always say to my students, it's a cost benefit analysis. And I've never suggested to any of my students that they play what I play on because
Mhm.
I think I'm probably kind of a weirdo down here in Atlanta playing these old flutes. I
That's
mean,
awesome.
nobody really plays old flutes anymore. But I do think with flutes, especially, there's so much equipment available to us now that is so fantastic and high quality. I encourage my students to play as many flutes as possible and start narrowing it down. You'll know it when you play it. You know, it's
Exactly.
very, very personal.
Was, Powell always in Boston, and how did Boston end up becoming, like, the flute central of the US? I feel like there's so many makers and flute things happening in Boston.
It really is the flute capital of the United States, and
Yeah,
I don't know if I can really historically answer that question, but I know that,
yeah.
um, before the Powell Company and the Haynes Company, the biggest game in town for flutes was Louis Lot coming from France, and, I don't know the exact history of whether it was Haynes or Powell that, kind of took over this flute making
Yeah,
in the United States and how all of these amazing flute makers, Haynes, Powell, Brannon, uh,
yeah.
Emmanuel, of course, all of these
There's so
wonderful
many.
flute makers that are all in Boston. So I've actually recommended to students of mine before we had these kind of conventions and things,
Right.
I said, you should go to Boston and just make the rounds of all the flute makers. So
Yeah. It's a stunning thing to have them all in one place like that.
it is.
What about summer festivals? You've done so many fun summer adventures. It sounds like you started at Tanglewood and you went to Marlborough too, right?
I did.
That and Tetons and Bellingham Festival. What is it that you
Yeah.
love about playing in the summer?
Well, the common thread between all of those things is that they're absolutely beautiful places to be in the
Mhm.
summer. Atlanta is not a great place to be in the summer. Just very hot and humid, and this California girl is not into that at all. So, a lot. So one of the wonderful things about a summer festival, first of all, it's in a beautiful place, and
Mhm.
then the schedule is typically more flexible and more and lighter than what
Mhm.
we experience in having a major orchestra schedule during the fall and the winter. And then the other thing about a summer festival is getting to meet players that I don't normally play with. It's
Yeah.
getting to play with different musicians that play in different places and have different lives during the year, and it really enriches us and recharges our batteries as musicians,
Mhm.
I think, to have these experiences, being able to connect with different audiences. I love my audience here in Atlanta, but being able to meet audiences and patrons and students as well,
Mhm.
in other parts of the country is very rejuvenating.
Do you do anything, to completely detox from music, that is like, "I'm gonna put my flute down and take a break," or do you like to just maintain all the time?
I typically take a pretty big break between my summer festivals and the beginning of our fall season, where I won't even take my flute out of the case for a week or 2,
Mhm.
and, I find that I really need that, and I come back
Yeah.
better if I do that. Typically, if I'm really taking a break, I'm visiting my family in California or going on a
Mhm.
trip somewhere fun with my family, um, and just not thinking about music at all. When
Yes.
it's not these times we're living in now, I do really love to travel and
Yes.
most of the time love to come out to the West Coast of the US because that's really my favorite place to be.
Yeah, back home. Last question for you. As we're let's assume we're going to be going back to a normal and maybe better future. Is there any projects that you're excited to do, or repertoire that you haven't played, or a solo album you wanted to always make? Something that you feel like, all right, I should do that now.
I thought about all of those things because 'cause we've all had time to think about those things
Yes.
during the pandemic. Yeah, I've definitely have thought about a solo album, where I get bogged down is what to record.
Yeah.
But I do have a wonderful pianist here in Atlanta that I have collaborated with for many years, and we've played a lot of the repertoire. Yes, I'm definitely looking at that. Another project that I really have been excited to be part of is a new ensemble here in Atlanta called the Marian Ensemble. And it is 5 members of the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra, 5 women, and we play music written by women composers who have perhaps been overlooked historically
Mhm.
or modern composers who are women. And it's
Cool.
been a really rewarding journey with this group. We've been playing together for almost 2 years. Planning on commissioning works. We were supposed to do a concert in Rio de Janeiro of course, it got canceled during the pandemic, but we
Oh,
plan to go back.
cool.
But a lot of projects planned with that group, and it's a really rewarding and wonderful group of ladies, and I'm really enjoying that.
That's so cool, and
Yeah.
varying instrumentations so you
Yes,
can do all sorts of music.
that's right.
That's tremendous.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for this. This has been so much fun.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us on Inside the Notes. Be sure to visit InsideTheNotes.com for additional content from our artists and guests, and click subscribe to stay up to date on future interviews. Until next time, this is your host, Erica Block.